Hello, my name is Catherine Lindley. I am a master's student at West Virginia University, and this presentation on L2 dialectal acquisition according to gender, identity, and social networks is a little bit part of my master's thesis that I have been working on for the past year or so. And let's just dive right in. So looking at gender and language as a motivation for the current study, many studies do agree that in the first language, women do prefer more prestigious dialects or more neutralized phonological sounds. And in the second language, there is evidence that women continue this preference towards more prestigious dialects or neutral sounds, and that may be influenced by instructors who use those more neutralized dialects in the classroom or contact with native speakers and them mimicking the women who prefer those prestigious dialects, and so that happens in the second language as well. One study actually did investigate the L2 acquisition of variational features during a study abroad trip to Egypt and did find that men were more likely to utilize these variational phonological features than the women. Many researchers do agree that there seems to be a connection between our social networks and the people with whom we surround ourselves with and the language that we end up producing. And this is shown really well in Eckert's study, showing that for their first language, social networks were actually a larger indicator, a larger predictor of phonological variation than other factors like socioeconomic class or age or gender. And while this study was just looking at the first language, the same may be true for the second language, as many studies do affirm that there seems to be a connection between our social networks in our L2 and the acquisition that comes from that. And so looking at social networks as part of the LangSnap project, where many of the data from the current study comes from, the quality of a social network is more important than the absence or the presence of a social network. And in their study, they look at social network and determine that quality by size, strength, and intensity. And in this study, it did show that many of the participants developed strong L2 relationships and strong social networks during the study abroad experience, and that having those social networks and those strong relationships was used as a form of motivation to make linguistic gains, specifically in oral fluency. This study did not look at phonological variation. So there does seem to be a connection between social networks and L2 dialectal acquisition, but they are also important as they contribute to the formation of our L2 identity, and it's demonstrated in this one study using a self-questionnaire that looked at participants' L2 usage that includes input and output, and it suggests that there is a relationship between social networks and identity, as the participants who were more confident in their L2 usage were more likely to build relationships around that second language and engaging with native speakers and engaging with other people in their L2, which then influence their perceptions of that target language and the culture, positively influencing their viewpoints towards them as well as their actions in kind of a cyclical way of then encouraging them to build more relationships. And defining identity is important as it is heavily constructed by social expectations, but Baumeister does a really good job of identifying and affirming the presence of the identity that is constructed by social expectations, but also our private identity of who we are when we're not around other people and who we understand ourselves to be and who we really are. But they both exist at the same time, and sometimes there's a difference between them, and that dissonance can be a motivator for change, as Dornier does a really good job at synthesizing in the L2 motivational self-system. So the L2 motivational self-system includes our L2 ideal self of who we want to ideally become in that second language, and then the feared self, which is who we do not want to become, and goals to achieve the ideal self, and ideas to avoid that feared self. And so using ourselves of who we want to be and who we do not want to be as motivators to continue to acquire a language. And this is demonstrated really well in Mitchell et al.'s study that explores the relationship of acquisition and L2 identity, and it did find that it was used as a motivator for participants to make gains in oral fluency. And as it relates to specifically L2 dialectal acquisition, there have been a few studies that have suggested that identifying with the target culture and having those positive L2 experiences might be related to higher levels of acquisition. So when it comes to L2 dialectal acquisition, many studies have looked at factors such as classroom exposure and instruction on dialects, study abroad, differing levels of proficiency, age, social networks, and identity, and there seems to be a connection between those and L2 dialectal acquisition, but there have not yet been any studies that specifically look at social networks, identity, and gender all at once and trying to find a connection to L2 dialectal acquisition of phonological features. And so the research questions for this project are, is there a difference between genders and acquisition of L2 variational features? In what way does identity influence acquisition of L2 variational features? And in what ways do social networks influence acquisition of L2 variational features? So a couple predictions or hypotheses on what might happen. According to prior research, males are going to be more likely to utilize certain variational features than females. Identity is going to positively influence L2 acquisition in the sense that positive experiences, positive identity, and identity with the target language and culture will influence L2 acquisition of variational features. And of course, having strong relationships with L2 speakers and having strong social networks will influence positively L2 acquisition. So talking about the methods of the study and the participants, it consists of 27 L2 Spanish learners from England who study abroad in either Spain or Mexico. 18 went to study abroad for an academic year in Spain, and 9 did the same in Mexico. Their ages range from 20 to 25, with a median being 20.7 and the standard deviation about a year or two. And it consists of 20 women and 7 men. 15 women went to Spain and 5 women went to Mexico. And of the 7 men, 3 went to Spain and 4 went to Mexico. So the 2 linguistic variables being analyzed in this study include the voiceless interdental fricative, la theta, and the voiceless uvular fricative. Both are very common features, characteristics of most regions in Spain, and as we had 18 participants study abroad in Spain, the majority of these participants really are interacting with these 2 features, but also there is a lot of evidence of prior exposure and or instruction potentially on these 2 features, as we'll see later that many of the participants were using either one or both of these features in the pretest. So with those participants that went to Mexico, we do see a loss in production of these features. So as part of the LangSnap project, it included 3 different tasks: a semi-structured interview, a picture retelling narrative, and a written assignment. So 2 oral tasks and 1 written task, and they were each given at 6 different collection points throughout the study, which includes a pretest, 3 visits abroad, and 2 post-tests. And this present study is just focused on the semi-structured interview at the pretest and the 3rd and sojourn visit, which happened at the tail end of their study abroad. And these tasks were chosen as there is a lot of oral data and natural speech in the semi-structured interviews, and the pretest accurately shows what their speaking patterns were prior to the study abroad, and at the in-sojourn 3 they are very immersed in the culture and in the L2, and it's very evident of what their speaking patterns are as a result of their stay. So when measuring social networks, the researchers with the LangSnap project were very much focused on measuring the quality rather than the absence or the presence of L2 social networks. And so they developed a social network questionnaire that was very in-depth at measuring their level of L2 relationships with other people in varying contexts, and this questionnaire was given at each in-sojourn visit in the data collection points. And then to quantify that data, they took 5 different areas to measure their social networks, and for each one that they were actively involved in, they received 1 point. So for a possible of 5 points, meaning that 5 points reflected a strong social network, and maybe a 1 or 2 reflected more of a weak social network. And the 5 different areas are shown on this slide. So here we have the results by gender for the participants who went to Mexico, and we have the pre-test and the post-test results for the interdental voiceless fricative, and it was predicted that men would actually use this feature more than women, but as we see in the pre-test, women are actually using the interdental voiceless fricative at slightly higher rates than men, and in the post-test there is almost no use at all of this variational feature. There was one instance of where one male participant used it in one context, and that was it. So that's why there's that little line there. But overall in the post-test, all participants basically ceased to use this variational feature after spending an academic year in Mexico. And so here we have the results by gender for the interdental fricative by the participants who went to Spain, and we do see that the women are using this feature less than men, both in the pre-test and the post-test. But in both the pre-test and the post-test, they are still using it at very high rates, a little over 40% in the pre-test and over 60% in the post-test. It is still less than the rates at which the men are using this feature, almost 100% in the post-test, but overall women are still using this feature a lot. So with the voiceless interdental fricative, this data shows the percentage at which the females are changing in their use before and after, as well as the males, in which case we see that the women are actually acquiring it more than the men are. Whereas the last slide showed that the men were using it at higher rates than women, we see that women are acquiring it more than men. And an effect size was ran for this data, which gave a number of a negative 0.0055, which shows a very, very small amount, so almost no indication of showing that gender was a likely predictor of acquisition of this specific variational feature. So here we have the different variations of the uvular fricative, so the velar fricative and the glottal fricative in the pretest for the participants who went to Mexico. And we see that out of all the participants, there is a preference for the glottal fricative, which is a little bit easier for those English speakers. The women seem to slightly prefer more the velar fricative, and the males slightly seem to prefer the uvular fricative, although there is only small trace amounts of use of that uvular fricative in the pretest out of any participants. And here we examine those same variants in the post-test for the participants who went to Mexico. So at the end of their academic year stay abroad in Mexico, and we see a clear preference by all participants towards that glottal fricative, even more so than in the pre-test. And in the post-test there is still use of this velar fricative. Women tend to use that at just a little bit more than those men, but even still, there's only a slight difference between the two, and there is just a very clear evidence towards preference of that glottal fricative. So here we have the uvular fricative and the glottal fricative and the velar fricative. So the uvular fricative is most common in Spain, and the glottal and at times the velar are more present in Mexico. And so this is the participants in Spain and the way that they are using this sound. And we see that in the pretest, all of the participants, both male and female, do prefer that glottal fricative. For English speakers, they do tend to prefer that sound more. But for the velar fricative, we see actually a lot more women using that than men. And for the uvular fricative, we do see a little bit of evidence in the pretest in certain women participants for those who went to Spain. And so here we have the data on those 3 different phonological features in the participants who went to Spain, organized by gender. And while we are still seeing a pretty clear preference for the glottal fricative, we do see a lot of change in the use of the velar fricative and the uvular fricative. And while the men do prefer the glottal fricative, we do see more females, slightly more females using the velar fricative, and more females acquiring that uvular fricative. And so contrary to the situation with the voiceless interdental fricative, where men were using it more, but women were acquiring it more, women are using the velar and uvular fricative slightly more than men, and they are acquiring it a little bit more than men. And the effect size was also ran for this data, and the R coefficient was 0.26, so higher than that of the interdental fricative, but still a low number, which means very little difference between the 2 genders in terms of their acquisition of this specific variational feature. So here we have the social network data. The social network data was just used for the participants who went to Spain, since the uvular fricative and interdental fricative are the features being looked at. It was important to just look at the participants who went to regions in which those features are most prominent. So in this specific chart, we're looking at the social network data and specifically the voiceless uvular fricative. And on the y-axis, we have the social network average scores over the 3 visit abroad data collection points. So at each visit abroad, they got a score, more or less, from 1 to 5. And the data here shows the average or the mean score of those 3 scores. And then, of course, on the x-axis, we have the percentage in which they increased in their usage of the uvular fricative. And we see a lot of variation in the participants here. There does seem to be a moderate correlation between having a strong social network and acquiring this uvular fricative. The R value of this is 0.4, so still a pretty low number, but still a moderate correlation. And what's really interesting is the same is not true for the interdental fricative for the Spanish participants. We actually see some participants use the interdental fricative less after their time abroad. We see a lot more variation at which rates they are acquiring this specific feature. We see the same variation in the social networks, but just kind of a lot weaker of a relationship here. The R value here is actually negative. It's negative 0.26, so still a very weak correlation, actually sort of suggesting that as L2 participants build L2 relationships, that they're actually going to use that interdental fricative less. But of course, the R value and the correlation here is very, very weak, so that claim really can't be made from the data presented. So here we have the social networks on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have the percentages of which the students are acquiring either the interdental fricative, which is in blue, the blue dots, or the uvular fricative, which is in the orange dots. And so this chart was kind of used to see if there was any sort of pattern, that if a student is acquiring the interdental fricative? Are they also going to acquire the uvular fricative? And ultimately, there really didn't seem to be any pattern at all to whether or not a participant was going to acquire one or both. It really just depended on each individual participant. So in their study, the LangSnap researchers identified 5 high achievers in the L2. So these 5 participants, the first 3 here who went to Spain and the last 2 went to Mexico, they were ones who made the largest gains in oral fluency. And in their book, the LangSnap researchers actually attributed this to having a strong identity and strong relationships, positive attitudes, positive experiences with the target language and culture. So here we have each participant alongside their social network score out of 5 and their percentage of change in the use of the interdental fricative after their time abroad. So for participant 168, who was considered to have strong and positive experiences, they only had a social network score of 2.67, showing an average social network. But they did increase in their use of La Theta, 71.3%, which is a pretty high increase. So perhaps identity did play a strong factor in that. And participant 169 had a slightly higher social network score of 3.67, but only an increase of 9.21%. So a little bit stronger social network score. A much smaller increase in their use of this variational feature, so not really sure whether or not identity played a role. And we have 173, who had a 5 out of 5 social network score, indicating a very strong L2 social network, but they actually decreased in their use of the interdental fricative by 8.06%. And this participant was still using this feature at a pretty high rate, but they really didn't improve that much during their time abroad, even though they had that very strong social network. And in the 2 participants who went to Mexico, 178 and 179, we have a 3.67 and a 4.33 social network score, both pretty on the higher side, both above the mean, and both decreased entirely in their use of the interdental fricative after their time abroad. Both participants used this prior to the trip, and neither participant used it after the trip. So moving on to the discussion of the results, the first research question was, is there a difference between genders and acquisition of L2 variational features? Ultimately, and especially after running the effect size, there was really shown to be no difference between the 2 genders, which is quite contrary to prior research, which seemed to suggest that, especially in the L1, but also perhaps in the L2, that men were more likely to acquire dialectal features. And I sort of give 2 reasons as to why this was not the case in the present study. So the first reason is that the participants in the present study really didn't have different experiences according to gender. They lived quite similar lives, had very similar experiences. It really didn't differ according to gender, and in one study that showed that men were more likely to acquire variational features, the women and men had very different experiences according to gender. Women did not want to acquire these dialectal features as to not draw more attention to themselves. So there was a lot of different dynamics at play in that specific study, whereas those just really weren't issues at all in the current study. And the second reason that this may have been the case is that the 2 features looked at in this current study are considered more standard variants and don't really have a level of prestige or stigmatization about them. And so ultimately, this study didn't really show that there were any differences between genders in L2 acquisition of these 2 specific features, though in different kinds of studies, you could still try to prove that. And so moving on to discussion of identity, the second research question was, in what way does identity influence acquisition of L2 variational features? So looking at these case studies of the 5 high achievers in the L2 according to the prior LangSnap research, we saw a lot of variation according to social network and increase or decrease in the use of the interdental fricative. And so one of the reasons that identity may not have played a large role in the acquisition of these features is their study abroad experience and the fact that it is truly a multilingual experience. They may have cultivated and developed strong social networks and strong relationships, but ultimately a lot of those relationships were in mixed context of using the L2 and L1, and the most important part was not necessarily having those strong relationships, but were they active in engaging in cultivating those social networks. And so not necessarily looking at development of social networks and whether or not they truly were able to develop those, but were they truly involved? Were they the ones initiating those strong relationships with the L2 speakers? Another thing is that social networks often influence our L2 identity and our L2 dialect, but that may not always be the case, and that may have just been the case for this study, is that the social networks just really had nothing to do with the identity of the participants, which ultimately was likely the case, as the research on the LangSnap participants seems to highly suggest that the participant's identity was truly that of a temporary sojourner. So they really didn't identify with the target language or the culture. So it absolutely makes sense that they would not acquire those variational features if they did not desire to identify with that region. With one specific quote from Mitchell et al. Being, however, they were often ambivalent about regional varieties and accent, pleased to develop some awareness of these, but not generally motivated to acquire them, which seemed to be the case with identity here in this study. And the last research question was, in what ways do social networks influence acquisition of L2 variational features? Again, we did see a moderate correlation between the uvular fricative and strong social networks, but then we saw quite the opposite with the interdental fricative. We saw a weak negative correlation with the social networks and interdental fricative, and there are a couple of reasons why this may have happened as well. And a big reason is, as I mentioned previously, the social networks and the lack of influence that it had with identity. So if the participants are not identifying with that culture or with the social networks and the relationships that they are building, it's of course very likely that they will not acquire these L2 variational features, and very understandable that that may not have happened. Another possible reason is the type of social networks that they were building, the data that we had available. We could really kind of look at the social networks as a whole, not really looking at the raw data. So the use of the L2, as well as with whom they were using that with, was not properly analyzed. So this means that a participant could have had a very strong social network, but could have been using Spanish as more of a lingua franca. So with maybe other study abroad students, people who do not have Spanish as their L1, maybe have French or Italian or German as their L1, and they're using Spanish as a lingua franca, and so of course they would not be using those variational features that are salient in that specific region. So if we had raw data to suggest that they were speaking with native speakers from the region who do actively use those variational features, we could make more claims, but ultimately we just don't have that data available at this time. And so concluding with a review over a couple limitations as well as some ideas for future research, as I just mentioned, having the raw data from those social networks would have been very beneficial to this study to truly see if social networks had or did not have an impact, or if it was just the types of relationships that were built within those participants and their social networks during their study abroad. Which also just shows a flaw in the design of the social network questionnaire. that it was not designed for a study on variational acquisition, and so we just really didn't have that data available to gather on those social networks to see if they were really interacting with native speakers from that region, or if they were just using the L2 overall. As well as the variables that were analyzed in this study according to gender, they were neither stigmatized nor prestigious. They were both just incredibly salient to that dialect, and so for ideas for future research, to look at different variables that might be a little bit more stigmatized. So looking on certain areas where the dialect may shift a little bit, depending on a certain variable, and looking at that specifically according to gender in the L2 would be very interesting, as well as, of course, designing a study similar to the Langsat project, but that focuses specifically on identity or social networks, and so gathering that data on social networks and L2 usage with native speakers from that specific region in order to truly gauge whether or not that is related to acquisition of L2 variational features. So thank you so much for watching my presentation on L2 dialectal acquisition of variational features according to gender, identity, and social networks. Again, my name is Catherine Lindley. I'm a master's student at West Virginia University, and if you have any questions regarding this study or the Langsat project or any of the results, please email me here, and I'd be happy to talk more about it. Thank you so much.